Beer, a global drink enjoyed by millions. From lager to stout, pale ale to heavy, beer is an extremely versatile drink, ranging from next to no alcoholic content to the other side of the spectrum, surpassing whisky and most spirits, and all from just 4 ingredients: water, barley, hops and yeast.
Hi, I'm Andy.
And I'm Will.
In a few moments, we're going to take you through the process of brewing beer in your home or flat. You might have thought this was a complicated process, but we're going to reveal that it's not.
But first, let's have a look at the ingredients that make beer.
Today we'll be making an Irish red ale. The most important ingredient is our base grain, which is a simple pale malt. We add several specialty grains to add texture, body and colour. The Lovibond value given to a grain dictates the amount of colour imparted onto the beer. Finally, we will add hops to contribute bitterness and fruity aromas to the beer. In this brew, we're using both loose leaf and pellet varieties. We'll talk in detail later about these ingredients.
As Andy and Will have shown, beer comes from very simple and humble ingredients. And even though in today's brewing practices there's a certain level of complexity, drinking beer has stood the test of time, surviving millennia and acting as the catalyst for the advancement in scientific, medical and agricultural progress.
Beer can trace its roots back to 4000 BC, where the Sumerian people from the Middle East were said to have discovered that by mixing grain with water, they could create a bread-like substance which provided what they believed to be divine properties. This in turn led to settlements aggregating around crops which were essential for not only bread but also beer, which over time no longer held divine properties but was recognised as a source of sustenance. By the time of the ancient Egyptians, beer was an integral part of the diet for the common man, with wine reserved for the elite. The importance of beer to the Egyptians was so much so that in the tombs of the pharaohs, archaeologists discovered models of people brewing so that the pharaohs had beer in the afterlife. As the techniques of brewing spread across the world, settlements would use whatever the native crop was to make beer, and when these techniques eventually reached Northern Europe, over 2000 years ago, barley-based beer was born. And with that, the transition from mushy bread into the liquid we know today. This evolution of beer was spurred on by the need for peasants who worked exceptionally long hours to have access to a highly nutritionally dense food source that would sustain them from day to day. They recognised the liquid form of beer as an invaluable source of sugar and other nutrients which could not be obtained from anywhere else or consumed as easily. Moving to the 10th century, brewing occurred on a much larger scale, with the main breweries being monasteries. The monasteries developed exquisite beers from which many of today's finest beers can trace their roots back to. It is worth noting that in this age beer was still a vital part of people's diets, with the average person consuming between 6 to 8 pints of ale a day, so it is understandable that the improvement to the taste of beer was a sought-out endeavour. It was also during this time that hops were introduced, and with this came the seismic shift away from sweet beers of the ancient time to the bitter, crisp beers we are more familiar with today.
Before we move on to talking about the brewing process, it's important that we take some time to talk about sterilisation.
Sterilisation is one of the most important parts of the brewing process. If you don't sterilise your equipment, your brew can be more susceptible to contamination from bacteria.
First, place all the equipment needed into a suitable container. The fermentation bin will do. Add a sterilising agent, we're using Starsan, then simply top it up with hot water. We've chosen Starsan as there's no need to rinse afterwards. However, household bleach can be used as an alternative. If using bleach, be sure to use a small amount and rinse thoroughly with cold water afterwards. Once everything is fully submerged, give it a stir and leave for 10 minutes.
The first piece of equipment we will use will be spoons. After this, a plastic mixing spoon, a hydrometer which will be used to check the gravity reading of the brew, a thermometer which will be used to confirm the temperature, siphoning equipment, funnel, and airlock which will be used in the fermentation process, which will ensure that no oxygen will enter the fermentation vessel during fermentation. A fermentation bin, we will be using this to mash our grains, and a 1 gallon glass demijohn, which we will be using as our fermentation vessel.
Now we've done some preparation, let's have a look at the first process of the brewing, the mash.
Mashing is the process of steeping the grains in hot water to release the sugars needed for fermentation. The temperature that the water is maintained at affects the type of sugars that are released from the grains. But for our brewing, we're just going to focus on the fact that steeping releases the sugars.
Heat your mash water to 77 degrees centigrade. Add your grains to the mash tun. We are using muslin bags to allow us to remove the grains easily. Add your mash water, mix, and leave to steep for 1 hour.
After the mash comes sparging. This is simply rinsing the grain to extract the remaining sugars. We're batch sparging as opposed to continuous sparging.
Now that we've mashed and sparged our grains in water, the next process is to boil them with hops.
Typical amount of time to boil wort for is about an hour, and the time at which you add the hops can affect how fruity or bitter the beer is.
Hops are categorized by their alpha acid value. A higher acidity means a more bitter beer. Our bittering hops are Chinook. Boil your bittering hops for an hour and add your aroma hops after half an hour.
After boiling with hops, chill the wort down to room temperature using an ice bath. Siphon the chilled wort into a clean, sterilised demijohn. We're using a fine filter to get the clearest beer we can. Now it's time to pitch your yeast. We like to activate our yeast beforehand in a solution of sugar water, but you can add it dry if you want. Give the demijohn a good shake to aerate it and then simply fit the airlock. Leave to ferment for 2 weeks and then it's ready to bottle.
After a day, your fermentation should look like this. Notice how carbon dioxide is escaping from the air filter. Your fermentation is over when the bubbles stop.
In the past, brewing beer was not an exact science, but over the years it's become a more refined process, with exact measurements in fermentation time, temperature and ratio of ingredients. Ashes to beer have also dramatically changed, with no longer being considered a viable part of the human diet. Today it is enjoyed in moderation as part of our culture and celebrations.
Moving forward, it is again the Germans who can be credited with the next major development of beer. In the early 1800s, monks accidentally created a new type of beer, the most popular one in the world today, lager. They got into the habit of storing their beer in cold caves and caverns, which led to a different chemical reaction happening between the sugars and yeast. It is also during this time we see science beginning to be applied to the brewing process, with Gabriel Siedermeier being credited with the first person to bring a saccharometer and thermometer for measuring sugar content and temperature of the beer. The beer he produced would not be typical of the lager known today, as it had a dark copper hue. It was Joseph Grohl who produced the first light golden lager after experimenting with very pale malt as the base ingredient. Interestingly, this coincided with the new trend sweeping across Europe of glassware being used in place of tankards. All of a sudden, beer had to look aesthetically appealing, with greater attention to colour and clearness, and with this, Pilsner Lager was born. As science became a more important factor in the brewing of beer, it did not take long until the realisation that yeast was an organic organism. It was Louis Pasteur in the late 1860s who decided to put beer under a microscope and made the monumental discovery, which allowed for the first time fermentation to be scientifically controlled, monitored and preserved through the methods of pasteurisation. Beer would continue to grow exponentially as a global commodity, with a small number of super brewers producing most of the world's beers. This created a consumer need for something else, something more diverse, and in 1997 craft brewing would begin with Jack McAuliffe. This created a consumer need for something else, something more diverse, and in 1997 craft brewing would begin with Jack McAuliffe creating the microbrewery, the Red Albion Brewing Company. Over the following years, more and more people would set up their own small breweries, with some becoming global brands. Even with some global brands in craft beer, it seems as though beer has come full circle, with smaller unique brews becoming more sought after over mass-produced brands.
Now that we've boiled our wort with hops, all that's left to do is to move on to the final process in creating our beer. Yeast is added to the mixture, which then converts the extracted sugars into alcohol, giving us our beer.
The fermentation process can take up to 14 days, and then all that's left to do is to bottle our beer, then we're done.
So the next time you're enjoying a beer with your friends, spare a little thought for the importance that beer has had in human civilization, all from just 4 ingredients.